Okay, I think it's time to get started. Welcome everyone to this week's seminar. We're so pleased to have Dr. Grumbach here with us today. And I'm going to tell you just a little bit about him before we turn it over. Dr. Grumbach received his PhD in political science from the University of California, Berkeley. He then completed a postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics at Princeton University. Currently, he's an assistant professor of political science here at the University of Washington and a faculty associate with the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies, and is also affiliate faculty here at CSDE. Dr. Grumbach has published extensively in his research area, focusing on the political economy of the U.S. His work emphasizes public policy, racial and economic inequality, American federalism, and statistical methods. Today, his talk integrates the work reported in two manuscripts, one published in the American Political Science Review and the other published in Political Behavior. And we have links to both of these articles on the website, and we encourage you to go ahead and look there and take a look. The title of Dr. Grumbach's talk today is Gender, Race, and Intersectionality in Campaign Finance. And so thank you so much for being here today. We really appreciate it. I'll say one more thing. So we'll do our usual. Please put your questions in the Q&A as you think of them. And at the end, we'll go through those together. I will unmute you so that you can go ahead and, if you're okay with that, ask your question directly, and we'll have some back and forth discussion. So thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for the kind and accurate introduction. Great to be here at CSDE and at UW in general. Thanks for taking the time to watch this webinar, and please look forward to questions and comments. So this is work, as Maria mentioned, sort of combines a couple papers and some extension work and some additional papers, some of which are with Alexander Son, who's a PhD candidate at Berkeley, and some with Sarah Staszak at Princeton. So to summarize the sort of roadmap of the day, I'm going to be showing new descriptive evidence quantitatively that money in politics, campaign contributions to politicians in the US, overwhelmingly come from people who are white and people who are male. But then I'm going to discuss sort of theoretical reasons why diversifying the candidate pool, increasing the presence of women candidates and candidates of color running for offices from Congress down to state legislatures may diversify the sources of money in politics in American campaign finance. I'm then going to show sort of quantitative evidence that attempts in a causally identified way to show that a marginal increase in candidates of color or women candidates will increase the racial and gender diversity of money in politics. As you see in point number 3, the race effects are going to be much stronger than the gender effects, reflecting our overwhelmingly racialized sort of mass politics in the US at this particular moment. So the inspiration for this line of studies was really what I consider the fundamental puzzle of race and ethnic politics research in political science and public policy and political economy. And that is that after the Civil Rights Revolution, we saw the expansion of voting rights to African Americans in the South in a way that reduced turnout gaps between racial groups and overwhelmingly diversified the electorate in the US. This resulted in greater descriptive representation. In other words, greater numbers of legislators of color and female legislators in Congress, state legislators, mayor's offices, governor's offices, and so forth. We saw the increasing diversity of elected officials in the US following the diversification of the electorate. Despite these two trends, though, since the 1960s and 1970s, we've actually seen that progress on race and gender issues has been quite hard to come by in terms of national policy outcomes. So in recent decades, despite the diversification of the electorate and of Congress, we've seen the rise of authoritarian policing and mass incarceration. We've seen stagnating or even declining Black and Latino family wealth. So the decimation of Black family wealth, for example, 50% of Black family wealth destroyed in the financial crisis of 2008, and increased racial inequality of wealth and income. We see declining reproductive rights in the states. The resegregation of education and housing to the point where now public educational institutions are more racially segregated than they were in the mid-1970s. We've seen attacks on voting rights, the dismantling of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and increasingly precarious voting rights and forms of voter suppression, as well as a sort of overwhelmingly, 2017 through 2020, an authoritarian immigration policy. All of these generate this new puzzle. How, if the electorate and Congress have become more diverse, do outcomes seem to be stagnant or even declining in their quality for Americans of color and women? And one sort of under discussed potential mechanism here is that while scholars like myself who focus on racial inequality in American politics, we focused a lot on the act of voting and differences in voter turnout to explain differences in policy outcomes, but we haven't focused as much on the potential for there to be racial and gender inequality and other forms of participation, especially campaign contributions. There's been this renewed focus on campaign contributions and big money in politics as an explanation for income inequality in the US and why there aren't greater redistributive programs, universal health care, stronger minimum wage, and other sort of robust welfare state institutions the way similar developed democracies have. That has been explained through campaign contributions, but not racial inequality in policy outcomes. There's two kind of mechanisms that political science have come up with for how campaign contributions influence politicians in office. One is by selecting who is a viable candidate at the early stage of running for office and in primary elections. Campaign contributors serve as a selectorate. If you're in the Republican Party and you don't get through, for example, the Koch brothers primary, essentially, then you're not going to be able to run as a viable candidate in the general primary for the Republican nomination for example, a Senate seat or a presidential office. Second, campaign contributors, they have greater access to politicians. So campaign contributions don't necessarily just convert a politician. You can't give $10,000 to a politician and have them renege on some long-held belief. But what you can do is you can buy their time, essentially, make it easier for you and your affiliated group to get meetings with these politicians and influence them by lobbying them, influencing, for example, the fine print of policy. Both of these mechanisms, given that we expect campaign contributions to be very unequal by race and gender, these mechanisms may produce inequality in political outcomes. But we don't have much information on the racial and gender distribution of money in politics. Unlike voting and elections, where there's a tremendous amount of research on the racial and gender backgrounds of voters, as well as their age and income and so many characteristics of the electorate, of voters and non-voters, we don't know much about donors in American politics, despite this extremely important mechanism of participating in American politics being contributing money to campaigns. And when we just think about this qualitatively, it's pretty clear that campaign contributions will probably be mostly white. Here is just a descriptive plot over time of the earnings gap, the gender income gap that's been the topic more recently of in national politics, as well as the racial wealth gap, which has been expanding over time in contrast to the gender pay gap, which has narrowed slightly but is still quite wide. Here you see the top line is average white family wealth in contrast to the green and red lines, Latino and Black family wealth. And you see over time, the racial wealth gap is expanding, and because it takes money to contribute to campaigns, we expect most money in politics to be from white donors and also probably male donors. So we use some new techniques to try to get the first observational, sort of externally valid observational estimates of the donor pool in American politics. We use an increasingly popular technique to use essentially Bayes' rule with information about people's surnames and sort of the prevalence of the surname across racial groups in the US Census, as well as their geographic location, their census tract or block, which we have and which we use to back out the probability that a given individual in the campaign finance database belongs to a given census categorized racial group. So the racial groups are the census categories. We measure them discretely or in one group or another. That is Asian American, Latino, Black, or white. We can talk more in Q&A about, mixed people and intermarriage and all sorts of issues there. There's existing data that does a similar technique to estimate donor gender from Adam Bonica, and that uses prefixes like Mr. and Ms., as well as first name gender ratios to get probabilistic estimates of individuals' gender. So we use this technique to estimate race and combine it with the gender predictions to get the first externally, what we think is the first sort of observational estimate of the joint race gender distribution of money in politics. We also collect candidate racial backgrounds and candidate gender backgrounds, and some intrepid undergrad RAs helped us with that. We were actually quite pleased with the race estimates. We worried that maybe there's just not enough information based on geographic location and surname to be able to back out a precise estimate of an individual's racial background. But actually here we plot the distribution, sort of density plot of the posterior probabilities of correct racial codings for all of our individuals in this database. And the database is pretty massive. So it's 27 million unique individuals who made about 87 million unique individual donations to politicians from 1980 to 2012 for about $33 billion total. So this is all individual money, hard money contributions, not dark money post Citizens United, dark billionaire money, and also not money from political action committees and large corporations and trade associations and unions, not that individual money in politics. And here again, just to reiterate, an individual, their race prediction is based on the probability of that particular race R given their surname S and geography G, backed out with Bayes' rule. So mathematically it's actually quite simple. And here we see that the median posterior probability that we got an individual's racial coding correct is 0.887, which we were actually pretty hardened by. We thought it might actually be pretty bad, but we think these estimates are pretty precise. So then we were able to finally sort of uncover a descriptive distribution across time of the racial background of individual money in politics. So here we plot since 1980 through 2012. These are contributions to US House candidates, to general election nominees, Democratic and Republican. And what you see here is first just overall, when you add together Asian American money, Black money, and Latino money, never does it get much past 10% of all individual money in American politics. That is, of course, much smaller than the overall populations of these groups, even during the 1980s when the US was less diverse. You also see not much sort of change appreciably across time in the racial distribution of money in politics, a bit of an increase in Asian American and Latino money as a share of the total money in politics, but that tends to replace Black money rather than white money. I, of course, don't plot the proportion from white donors because you wouldn't be able to see these other groups because their proportions are so small. So compared to other key populations in American politics, the money in politics is starkly racially unrepresentative. So we often complain, you know, people like myself and who study political science and elections, we go, oh, the electorate, the people who vote in American elections, registered voters, for example, that's an unrepresentative group, right? There's too few Latinos in this group compared to their percentage of the population, too few Asian Americans. Black Americans are barely becoming the share of the electorate that they are of the overall eligible voter population. And then we go to, for example, members of Congress. This is in the last Congress, the most diverse Congress ever. And we lament, it's still starkly underrepresented are Asian, Black, and Latino Americans. But then you go over to donors, or similarly to overall money in politics, the population there is, the distribution is so much more unrepresentative of the racial makeup of the US than even these other groups, these other key groups in American politics, registered voters and members of Congress. When you break this down to the intersection of race and gender, it becomes even more concerning. So here on the left, I plot the percentage, the proportion of total individual money that comes from women of color, and on the right from men of color. Again, both of these groups are extremely underrepresented in American politics compared to their share of the population. But if you just look here, women of color total make up approximately 2% in recent elections of money in politics, of individual money in politics. Black and Latino women on their own make up over 30% of the US population, or over 16%, and then Black and Latino Americans total over 30%. This is stark underrepresentation. So just looking at sort of factors of underrepresentation, how many times underrepresented are they compared to their share of the population? White women are underrepresented by a factor of 2, so there is this gender bias even towards white women. Men of color are underrepresented by a factor of 4 in money and politics. Women of color are underrepresented by a factor of 10. This is severe underrepresentation in a key form of political participation in the US. But there's some strong reasons to believe that if parties and organizations attempted to run and nominate more candidates of color and women candidates, that maybe money in politics would change accordingly. This would shift, this would sort of inspire donors of color to contribute to those particular campaigns. These are some sort of psychological mechanisms behind this coming out of sociology and the race and ethnic politics literature. For example, empowerment theory is the notion that if you see a viable candidate that shares your marginalized racial identity, you will feel empowered that you are included in politics and that you can go on and should participate because it might be efficacious. Here is the sort of famous empowerment theory-based photo of Barack Obama. Same thing, there are mechanisms not from sort of human psychology, but from campaigns and organizations themselves that probably lead to a sort of co-ethnic contribution effect where running more candidates of color will increase donations of from donors of color and so forth. And first is that candidates typically solicit donations from their professional and social networks, which in American history, of course, are highly racialized and gendered. So for example, the most politicians come from the legal profession, but law schools were essentially not open to African Americans until, for the most part, in some cases, really the 1970s. That led to a deep racialized sort of network structure in American legal institutions, and groups like the National Hispanic Bar Association and Conference of African American Lawyers and so forth. And those groups serve as networks that emerging Black and Latino politicians may tap on to increase contributions from people that share their racial identity and have some disposable income to donate to politicians. Candidates also appeal based on shared race and ethnicity as well as gender. So here's a classic sort of Spanish language ad from Jimmy Gomez. And groups like Emily's List are essentially there to say, okay, like upper income women, let's get together and finance, help fund women candidates campaigns. These are key groups that sort of are based in shared identity and for the purpose of marshaling money to support candidates that share that identity. Finally, overall, we might see a greater sort of co-ethnic contribution effect, even than like a co-ethnic voting effect, because unlike voting in money in politics, you can donate to any candidate across the country. Whereas if we're voting, you know, in Seattle, you have one particular House general election, right? And you, in a given cycle, have one Senate election. It may be unlikely that a viable candidate that shares your race ever appears over long stretches of time in your given district, right? But in terms of money in politics, you can always look across the country for somebody that shares your racial or gender or intersectional race gender identity. Here's a quote from Bill Carrick, who is an advisor to Loretta Sanchez as she ran for the Senate in California, was, "We're certainly going to reach out to the Latino community in California and all across the country, as well as the groups, but we're going to have to work really hard to raise the money, and it will have to come from sources all over the place," right? Our voters aren't coming from all over the place, but the money might. However, in thinking through this theory, I and my co-authors were worried, like sometimes occurs in voting, that running and nominating more candidates of color may lead to a white backlash, where donors who would traditionally give to Democratic candidates, in this case, for example, because most candidates of color are Democrats, they may end up pulling away their donations or donating to Republican opponents upon seeing a Democratic candidate of color emerge, right? This is true. Ebanya Washington, the economist, finds this is true in elections where when Black Democrats run, they actually reduce white turnout for them and increase white support for their Republican opponent. So the question here is, are we going to observe this type of dynamic in campaign contributions? We're going to look for this reason where I'm going to separate a couple sort of outcome quantities of interest. First, proportions and shares of money to answer the question whether in an election, money in politics diversifies as more candidates of color or women candidates run. And second, we're going to look at the amounts to the candidate who is the marginal candidate who is non-white or female, and amounts to their opponent to see if there's this sort of backlash effect. To get the causally identified estimate of the causal effect of candidates' identity on outcomes in money and politics, there are huge challenges to this. There's a ton of sort of endogenous feedback processes that go into how an individual's identity, a candidate's identity affects outcomes. First, candidate ethno-race and district composition, the demographics of a district are highly correlated, right? So it's hard to disentangle. Latino candidates may get more Latino money, but it may just be because they run in Latino districts. Candidates may emerge through a sort of reverse causal process. They see latent donors of color in an area, for example, and then they emerge. That may be the process. And then overall, candidates of color and women candidates are systematically different from white and male candidates on a number of dimensions. For example, career backgrounds. Candidates of color are more likely to come from business backgrounds and less from law, given sort of the history of discrimination in law. Women candidates tend to be higher quality on average on a number of dimensions than their male counterparts, probably because of earlier experiences of discrimination in the political process that leads to the point where if you're running for Congress and you're a woman, you're on average going to be a stronger fundraiser overall, and you're going to be a more competitive candidate because you've made it through those earlier stages of discrimination. However, in the causal identification sort of DAG setup here, most of those things are post-treatment to identity, right? So somebody's experience of discrimination, for example, is the result of their identity, not a cause of their identity. But this is an ongoing sort of it's both statistical and philosophical debate in the social sciences about whether identity can be a treatment variable in quantitative studies with causal questions. But the research designs we use to try to circumvent a lot of these challenges that, it's never going to be perfect because we can't randomly assign candidate race and things like that. But we do sort of classic diff and diff within districts to see within district when a candidate of color runs, does the district elections sort of composition of money change? And we also do a regression discontinuity design. I have those in the results of that in the extra slides, but it's all consistent. Regression discontinuity designs based on close elections are ones where we say in a primary election, we're going to compare the cases when a candidate of color or a woman candidate barely beats a white or a male candidate in a primary. So there's some randomness around that cut point of the primary election threshold of being the winner of the primary that generates randomness to the point where that candidate's identity is randomly assigned to the general election when they run against the other party. Happy to talk about that more in Q&A. So here's the diff and diff results on overall composition of money in politics and elections as the outcome. When the Democratic candidate is Latino, Black, or Asian, relative to the omitted category, this dashed line here, which is when the Democratic nominee is white. So when the Democratic nominee is white, relative to that, when a Latino Democrat is the nominee, what happens to Asian American money? The top of these panels are the sources of money, the racial group giving them money. So here what you see is not much change for Latinos and Black candidates compared to white candidates when it comes to Asian money. But when the Democratic nominee is Asian, Asian Americans represent a much greater share of the money in that election in this difference in difference setup, right? So this is within district, eliminating all sort of time invariant differences across districts here. When an Asian candidate is the nominee, there's a lot more Asian money in the election. This is true of the rest of the racial groups here. Black candidates increase money from Black donors, Latino candidates from Latino donors. And interestingly, these candidates of color don't see very significant decreases in white money, right? So this, on the x-axis is the outcome, the log total contributions from the given racial group. Latino, Black, and Asian Democrats don't raise less money from white donors than white Democrats do. That's the first thing. But again, we should also look at what happens to the Republican opponents' funding to see whether there's a backlash. But at least we find that there's no decrease in white money going to the Democratic nominee when the Democratic nominee is a person of color. We also find that there's no change to Republican fundraising based on the race of the Democratic candidate. So the one little exception here is that when the Democrat is Latino, the Republican actually gets a little more Latino money, and we think that may be something about districts that we didn't essentially difference out. And then when the Democratic candidate is Black, the Republican nominee, their opponent, gets a little less.
Jake, are you able to hear me?
Oh, something happened. Yeah, sorry about that.
Yeah, your audio went out, so maybe.
How long was it? Hopefully not too long.
No, not too long, about 30 seconds maybe.
Oh, 30 seconds, that's pretty long.
Well, last 20 seconds.
All right. So,
it's not that bad, actually. It's not that bad.
Great. Let me just double check my input volume. I think it's down low. Okay, looks okay. All right, so here the point is, I'll go through this quickly again. When the Democrat is a candidate, Democratic nominee of color relative to the omitted category white Democratic nominee, they increase the log total of money coming from their ethno-racial group. And then they don't decrease money from white donors. They actually earn approximately the same amount from white donors while increasing co-ethnic contributions. This is in the diff and diff design. Then also extending this potential for sort of donor backlash to Democrats of color, you actually see that the Republican opponent here does not increase their money from white contributors or from donors of color when the Democrat is a candidate of color compared to a white Democrat. So there's no evidence of backlash. If anything, it looks like Democratic candidates of color are a bit more competitive fundraisers. They increase money from people who share their ethnic background and don't really decrease white money. And Republican opponents tend to earn exactly the same amount as they would if the Democrat were white. In terms of gender here, we show that for both Democrats and Republicans, female candidates compared to male candidates, the dashed line, the omitted category male candidates, women earn as much or more. Democratic women candidates earn significantly more from women here. And they actually often in some of these designs, they significantly increase money from male donors as well. So on average, women are more competitive fundraisers, especially in the Democratic Party. But this is also true up top here with Republican women. However, when you put these identity groups into a large intersectional model, in this case, like a stacked diff and diff design with fixed effects for each race gender combination of money to see, okay, what is the relative increase in money from a given group of donors when that group of donors shares the race of the candidate, shares the gender of the candidate, or in the interaction shares both identities with the candidate. And here what you just see overall is that the race effect, whether looking at all donors, all women donors, or just women of color donors, sharing the racial background with a candidate predicts increased donations from that racial group dramatically, whereas gender is a much smaller effect. This sort of reflects, it's actually quite similar in voting where we see some gender gaps in voting. For example, women, if you know a person's female, you can tell they're more likely to vote for Democrats compared to men. However, if you know somebody's race, you have much more predictive capacity to tell how they're going to vote and their partisanship. Overall, those estimates of like the shared race effect are pretty massive in the context of political science and American politics. So where in terms of voting, district demographics really matter. You don't see much change in voter turnout based on the race of the candidate, but you do see big differences in turnout based on the composition of districts. In contrast, in money and politics, we see that the candidate's identity really overwhelms the effect of district demographics. So for example, the effect of nominating a Latino candidate is equivalent in changing money and politics to moving from Connecticut's 3rd district, which has basically no Latinos in it, to Texas's 16th district with El Paso. That's a massive change. The equivalent of running a Latino candidate in, a non-Latino place in Vermont is still massive compared to changing the district demographics if you want to tell where the money in politics is coming from. We do a series of robustness checks, but I think in the interest of time, I should skip those, but happy to talk more about placebos and, robustness checks and things like that. But there are I think some key big picture implications for the political parties, for law, and for political economy. So first is that there's really, for the parties, there's no campaign finance reason, especially for Democrats, but for the most part for Republicans as well, to not run and nominate more women and candidates of color. They don't experience any decrease in overall fundraising. They're at least as competitive against their opponents in fundraising, and they diversify the pool of money in politics. In terms of campaign finance reform and law, this is extremely critical as well. This teaches us a lot about what the potential is for different campaign finance reforms are to change sort of racial inequality in money in politics. So first, could stricter contribution limits, just reducing the maximum donation size, could that affect the racial distribution of money in politics? And we actually find not really in, like, we don't observe extremely small donations in this data, but even observing relatively small donations, we actually find that these hard money contributions, right? These are like ordinary individual donations, not dark money Citizens United, but regular contributions don't vary in contribution size based on race of contributor. So it's unclear whether stricter contribution limits would change the racial or gender makeup of money in politics. But in contrast, Seattle's form of democracy vouchers, a form of public financing where everybody gets a sort of credit they can donate to a candidate. And if a candidate opts into that system, they don't take outside other money, right? That ties the racial distribution of money in politics to the racial distribution of residents in the district, right? That would, if we implemented that throughout the country, that would mean money in politics would get quite close to the racial makeup of the country, assuming that candidates opt into that system if it, finances them well enough. So that's a very hopeful sign, Seattle's democracy voucher program. Repealing Citizens United, we don't have data because it's dark money, right? That's the point of it being dark. It's it's anonymous contributions through 501c4 pass-through super PAC organizations and so forth. But just qualitatively and looking at the distribution of super wealthy rogue billionaires and hidden in various caves, they tend to be mostly white. So Oprah and Jay-Z and Beyonce and other billionaires of color are not going to match the Koch brothers, the Sheldon Adelsons, Tom Steyers, and so forth in dark money spending. That's my speculation. Like, I don't have hard data on that, but I'm making an educated guess there. Finally, the racial inequity in money in politics may violate the Voting Rights Act, Section 2 specifically. I'm writing a law review piece with some legal scholars on this. The courts are not going to really accept this argument at this point, given the makeup of the courts, but contributions in the US compared to other industrialized democracies are an extremely important form of participation, and they're overwhelmingly white dominated. And as legal scholar Spencer Overton said, state-sanctioned discrimination against racial minorities has contributed to current racial disparities in property distribution. In other words, the legacy of slavery, redlining, institutional racism, discrimination, all of these implicate the state and have helped to create racial wealth gaps, which are then replicated in political participation due to the current campaign finance system. This means people of color, by the legacy of institutional racism, having less wealth, are less able to participate in money in politics, meaning the system is biased against them, meaning it's unconstitutional according to the law of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. My sort of shtick that I like to end on in this set of projects is that in my world, the study of race and ethnicity especially, and also to some extent gender, is overwhelmingly psychological. It's behavioral. It's about explaining differences in attitudes and partisanship between and across, within and across racial groups, right? That's a key thing. Why do Black voters overwhelmingly vote for Democrats, and Latino men, may have turned a bit more to Trump this year? What's the psychology of all this? I've learned a lot from that line of research. However, there's this alternative tradition that I'm trying to reinvigorate and playing a role with a lot of junior scholars like around the country in this, to emphasize the political economy dynamics of race and gender and intersectionality, to really think through the material, wealth-based and policy-based inequalities in specifically American politics and the American political economy. So far in poli-sci, it's concentrated in more historical scholarship, and a new group that focuses on mass incarceration and criminal justice. But I'm hoping projects like this on money in politics and race and gender, as well as all sorts of other things on, on labor relations by race and gender, and so much more can open up a new window to understanding racial and gender and intersectional inequality in the US. Thanks so much for your time, and I really look forward to answering questions. Why don't I stop screen sharing for now? And I can go back to any slides we need to.
Thanks so much, Dr. Grumbach. That was great and timely, and I'm sure we're all making connections. Any questions? Please put them in the Q&A.
Jenny asks about the race imputation process. What was the validation process for that? 88% precision compared to what? So because we have the full census distribution of surnames by race, right? The census does provide those aggregates. So you can back out the posterior probabilities that a given name is of a different discrete racial group, plus the census releases the racial distribution down to census block as well. So we have the full distribution. We have probabilistically the full population of a given name and a given location. So if you live in a more racially diverse area, then we're going to have a less precise estimate, right? And if your name shares a name with other racial groups more frequently, then that's also going to produce less of a precise estimate of racial background. So the key here, the big hidden bodies in this project are for African American predictions, especially some obvious issues with mixed people, intermarriage, Latinos who have Germanic and other sort of non-Hispanic Spanish last names, who may also be phenotypically whiter ethnically, may be wealthier, live in particular parts of the country more likely, right? All of these things are pretty obvious, but they represent smaller shares of the population, so we're not super worried about them. The big worry is African-American codings because they share typically Anglo names that are derived from slaveholding families. For that reason, it's really hard to disentangle names like Jones, Johnson, Washington in especially the US South. For that reason, I'm working with computer scientists. We're doing first name algorithms based on scraping Wikipedia and instances of Wikipedia associations of first names, because especially with African-American first names, there's a tremendous amount of statistical capacity to improve prediction. But for Latino and Asian and white predictions, we're actually quite confident. Thanks for that great question. And
so Jenny, if you wanted to follow up, you're unmuted.
Oh, I'm sorry. I meant to wait for that. Sorry.
That's okay. Go ahead.
Jenny? He's not unmuted, actually. It looks like it.
Oh, sorry.
Well.
Oh, all right.
That way to me, but I wonder if maybe it turns off after.
Sorry, it was hid under my chat. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Jake, I'm asking this out of extreme self-interest. My name is Jenny. I can see you, but you can't see me. I'm a faculty member in social work and a longtime CSDE affiliate. And we're using the same census probability-based imputation for a big data set we've assembled using Washington State administrative data. So we also have voter registration data in it. We have driver's license data. But if you and the computer scientists would like to collaborate on this for about a fifth of our sample, we also have self-report race data via human services records. And so, yes, I'm just tremendously interested in this. But I was wondering, when you said you were able to get kind of 88% certainty, like what, was that just you felt like you could identify a race, like an ethno race classification?
Right. So
yeah, so there were some people where it was kind of ambiguous.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
So if you remember that slide, I could go back to it. The density plot is the distribution of sort of how precise each estimate is. So the bulk were pretty precise estimates around 90.9 and above. And then there's a like a group that where it's more like 0.5. But one thing I want to say is this is because we did this with discrete racial groups, like you can't be a member of multiple racial groups in our coding. Because of that, it's actually nice. So the probability, if some individual has a 0.8, we estimate a 0.8% chance they're Asian American. There's only a 0.2% chance they're any of the other racial categories, right? Combined, the complement of that set. So it's actually, even if you get like 0.5 precision on an individual, it's that all the three other racial groups add up to a probability of 0.5. So it's not actually that bad, I think. But the point is, it's like the stats on this is just Bayes' rule, which is nice, where you just go through, okay, what's the probability there? This race given, right? And you literally just put it in the Bayes' rule equation. Given this probability, this name is this race, and do the same thing with the geography of race. And then you can get, so if you believe the census has everybody in it, that means this is actually a sharp probability, like not an estimate, but rather just literally the probability of correct racial coding. So we like that because you can build in some uncertainty to later statistical modeling, but it's not the most crucial. But the other thing though is the voter files these days, like I don't know what, so all these firms like Catalyst and L2 that aggregate that do the big voter file stuff, and UW has some access to them, to Washington State-based ones, but they have often augmented like commercial-based predictions of race, which are probably better than this. So they don't, it's a black box. They don't tell us how they run the models, but I'm pretty sure it's based on like consumer behavior. So they merge the voter file, whether you turned out to vote, your location, your likely income, with like your smartphone data and what ads you click on and what magazines you subscribe to and so forth. And they use that commercial data and say like, all right, this person subscribes to Guns and Ammo. That person's male and white probably, like, or this person subscribes to, you know, Essence and like it's really that deep, and that there's a ton to know from that. The first name thing is kind of like
all without IRBs.
Exactly, it's amazing. Yeah, we got to move to industry, Jenny. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, exactly.
I know. I could just merge. All right, thanks, Jake, and I'll send you a note offline too.
Great to virtually meet you.
Likewise. Mute me again, please.
Kyle,
and this time I'll wait for Kyle. Let's do that.
Yeah, so Jake, this is super fascinating. I hate to keep it in the realm of methodology, just because I'm really interested in the substantive part of this as well, especially this turn from kind of the psychological basis of this kind of analysis to the political economy part. So I hope we get a chance to hear a little bit more. But as long as we're geeking out on the methodology part, I'm interested to hear what you've done to investigate kind of the variation in the reliability of your race estimates across metropolitan areas, and lots of different metropolitan characteristics that can go into it. What comes to mind for me is segregation, where the tracked racial composition will be, at least theoretically, a less good measure of race in that situation. So anything that you want to riff on there?
That's so, I think that's so great and exactly right. So down at the block level, segregation could actually help, where if segregation overlaps with the block, then, if you live in that particular block versus the next door block, the same name Jones, it will be able to extract much more predictive capacity from the geography. On the other hand, if the segregation overlaps is within a block, then that's not the case. It's really just one thing. So there's a number of things here, but so first is that there are a number of like geographic potential confounders that, if we thought this through, could bias the more causal estimates here. So one is, so the white predictions are more precise in areas in the north, where white names are more likely to be Southern or Eastern European. where those names are not shared by African Americans as likely. So that level of precision, if we really, if that measurement error goes in that way, where more northern urban areas that are more liberal, if picking out the white people is much more precise there, and we accidentally code a lot more white people in, for example, the South that are not actually white, then there may be some effect. This could bias, there may be more Black donors to Republicans than we imagine, given that we underestimate Black people in the South, for example. And I think we have an extension project that's basically specifically about geography here. Where's the money coming from? Are there sort of enclaves of donors of color, which I imagine is the case? And it's true when you look not racially, like so much money comes out of the Bay Area and New York for the Democratic Party, for example. Like, how does race work in contributing from there versus a place where you're a person of color in a mostly white and very conservative enclave in the country and things like that? I imagine the dynamics of which types of races people donate to really matter there. I don't think I did a great job with that question, but there's a number of pathways that could be problems.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, Jake. And I appreciate the fact that you converted that from a purely methodological question to a substantive question. I think there are lots of really interesting things that you can do to look at confounding there. So I like the way you're thinking about that. Thanks.
Well, thanks. Well, yeah, no, that's one cool thing about this is we actually, people who are interested in American politics and society generally have thoughts like the idea that, non-Hispanic surname Latinos, there may be more, now we just saw the discussion of Republican voting in Florida, right? And the idea that more Caribbean Latinos in Florida voted differently than Chicanos in the Southwest that carried Arizona for Biden Harris. And these things may interact with these data given the likelihood of the Florida names being more, being from European languages that are not Spanish, or even I don't know, I love or Japanese Peruvian, they could be.
Thanks again, Jake.
Thanks.
So I think Ian is the next question. He's unmuted or able to unmute himself, I think I should say.
Yeah, thanks, Maria. And thank you, Jake. So I'm sorry that all these questions are about the race imputation methods. I think that you've really used them for really cool things as well. So I want to highlight that. And I also use some of these methods, and I think they have potential, but we've been discussing some of their pitfalls. Right. So I have two questions. One of them is a straightforward one about how you make your aggregate measures. So do you count people as their highest probability or use the full breakdown? And then secondly, and maybe as a more involved question, how do you align this methodology, which imagines these discrete identifiable racial races, with sociological conceptualizations or even other conceptualizations of race, which think about it as part as socially constructed and include mixed race people and contextual things? Yeah.
Great, so good. So we did in the papers, we do both multiply the posterior probability by the amount and choose the highest racial probability coding for individuals. These were the former in here, but it's not very different. That's what we were really scared about. So here, the Black estimates in the aggregate are slightly higher than if you pick the highest racial coding.
That definitely happens to us in Washington State too.
Yeah, I imagine. But it wasn't as different as we had thought. Although there's some, so I don't know. There's, if you have a strong opinion on which is better. So I actually kind of like I don't know. Maybe it's just I'm taking cues from my discipline, but there's new things on, for example, probability of partisanship, like that if somebody's a registered Democrat or Republican in areas, and all this stuff about political segregation, or Democrats living in enclaves and Republicans in, echo chamber enclaves in their neighborhoods. And in those, typically people just do the highest coding. And I don't know, it seems a little, I don't know. I guess there's arguments for both ways here. And then
I
on
feel
the
like maybe
social, go for
yeah.
it.
I was gonna say, I think it connects to that second question. I think that in some ways it might be worth suggesting that we should make that choice based on how we think about that second question too.
I'd love to hear your thought there, the connection there. So on the social construction question, so the first thing is just that like these census categories are so politically derived. So first, of course, racial categorization as a social construct changes across space and time, fully in the sociological camp, and like, Omi and Wynant's racial formation style understanding of all this. I myself am mixed and would come up as like, Central European Jewish name, like would come up, presents major problems here. And for myself, thinking about my own, like how my own racial classification based what society would, the social contract would classify me depends on space and time. Pre-1964 South, it would be very different than contemporary Washington State for me. And like the meaning of race has shifted over this time period where via in that case, the legal construction of racial categories. But no, I'm so with you there. I don't know though, like the posterior probability thing, since it's still based on discrete categories, I'm not sure multiplying by the posterior probability is anything sort of what like is connected to conceptualizing race as sort of essential or construction, social construction. But if you have a thought there, that sounds super fascinating.
For a paper, I used it. I actually used the gender version of the similar software for a paper where we kind of interpreted it as there. It's a little bit more. I mean, I'm a non-binary person, but I think that it is also like a little bit simpler. But we've also used it to estimate at like aggregate levels to say, oh, if I want to estimate the effect that this has on Black residents of Seattle, using those higher numbers may be more useful because it suggests that maybe I am capturing people who have situations like you just discussed. Although it's hard to say necessarily if that would actually be true, and it'd be interesting to just to do some more work with these methods to see how well they reflect that.
Absolutely. No, I do want to validate it. So again, with the voter file discussion we were having before, some states do have in their voter registration databases that are everywhere are publicly available. Like you can always buy a voter file like at the state administrative office. They'll usually charge you a lot to like copy it on paper or something, but you can always see if your neighbors voted. You can't see who they voted for, but you can. And in some states, I think 3 states, they have people, they put their race on their voter registration. So we could validate this in that way, like merge, find the exact same, do a record linkage purely, and then validate in those states that we got this right. That's another next step. And this would matter a lot. Like, I think, again, we're really confident on the Asian and Latino predictions, but because the descriptive point, especially in like these legal battles, like the descriptive estimate of how much money is from Black donors really does matter. So yeah, we should get that right. I think.
Thank you so much for considering that, and great answers.
Oh, awesome. Great to hear.
Hi. I have also worked with name-based race identification, and I'd love to talk about it more, but I won't here. I'm just curious, the latest Senate elections seem to show that donations to candidates in places like Iowa and Maine and South Carolina were massive Democratic-leaning donation advantages. They didn't seem to do much, as those Republican candidates did extremely well. So how do you incorporate this into your political economy of elections?
It's a great point. So, I mean, we didn't get at, I should have said at some point first, just like, it's implied throughout, but just like, I first want to fundamentally, like, it's important we problematize campaign finance and suggest, even if it was racially representative, it's unlikely that it would sort of upend the like deeply entrenched inequities, including by race, because it's really an intersection of race and class and gender are many of these issues. So when we think about, this is not even your question, Mark, but I think it's crucial to say that while some form, like if we had a fully racially representative set of money in politics, it would still be heavily class biased, and there are intersectional forms of racism that operate by class, and same with sexism and misogyny. But then this point about money in politics at the margin is a really tough question. So what's the relevant counterfactual? Is it, it's unclear. Yeah, like the additional marginal dollar on top of that massive amount is unlikely to do much, but we're observing an equilibrium where both candidates are extremely well funded in this highly polarized context, especially in Senate elections and with the rise of like Act Blue and internet-based donating. So I'm not sure we can say money in politics hasn't mattered. The Democrats could have lost by a lot more and been uncompetitive had they not raised that much. But it does suggest just money in politics is at the, things like the Georgia's governor's race in 2018 or Beto O'Rourke's Texas Senate race, these sort of high profile Senate races, the Georgia runoffs right now, it's just unbelievable. And there is like, an equilibrium where we don't know what would happen if one sort of unilaterally disarmed in the money arms race. But my hunch is if we observed that ever, it would go bad for the one that didn't raise all that money. But you're right, like it also shows the limits in elections where it's extremely expensive and difficult to persuade somebody across party lines, and it's extremely hard to turn out a low propensity voter. This is record turnout 2018, 2020. Like we're back in the early 20th century, there are turnout levels this high, but this is much higher than the mid 2000s. Like when I came of age politically in the Bush administration, it was not like that. It's extremely high turnout of all demographic groups, young, compared to their relative rates before. So in that context, it's just extremely expensive at the margin. Remind me how much time we have.
So we're just a couple minutes over. If you're willing,
Gotcha.
people would like to follow up with you maybe individually I don't see any more questions right now. So we will conclude. So thank you again so much. It's exciting to hear about your work.
Great. Nice to meet everybody and be part of this scene. Yeah.
Sorry our platform doesn't show everybody. I think we might take a switch around on that front next quarter.
This was really nice getting people's voices and questions. So that's great. Well, cool. Well, hopefully COVID ends sometime soon. We can all do this in person.
Exactly. Thanks a lot, Jake.
Well, take care, Jake. It was nice meeting you.
all.
Bye.
Everyone else next week, right? Okay. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.